Thanks again for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about housing. As Valerie mentioned, I'm with Housing North, which is a brand new organization that has been known in its conceptual stages as the Northwest Michigan Rural Housing Partnership. So we picked a new name for very obvious reasons. It's a sentence-long name that we started with, so we're now officially Housing North. I am going to be talking, like Valerie said, about the development process and about some housing needs, but first want to give you a little bit of background about what Housing North is and who I am. Housing North was formed late last year with funding from Rotary Charities of Traverse City and the Fry Foundation in Grand Rapids. And Networks Northwest is providing operational support and office space, so it's essentially acting as an incubator for the organization. I worked as the Community Development Director for Networks Northwest. I was with Networks Northwest for about 10 years, working with communities throughout our 10-county region on a variety of issues: housing, transit, recreation, trails, whatever communities we're struggling with. Networks Northwest is really there to help them take the next steps. Over the last several years, though, it didn't matter where you went or what the topic nominally was. You could be talking about food trucks, and the next thing you know, you're talking about housing. Housing was the foundation of everyone's employment issues, talent attraction and recruitment issues, and then things like how you meet the needs of a changing population as your population ages. How are you able to provide services and housing for all of those people in your community. So housing is really everywhere, in everything, and we knew that there were a lot of gaps in terms of the resources that were and are available to help communities do what they need to do. There are a lot of developers that are working to, address some of the gaps out there, but again, they have issues with financing, with zoning, with policy that make their work a lot more difficult. So Housing North was formed as kind of a more holistic way to address the gaps that we have in the development process and to support developers and communities that are working to address housing needs. As I mentioned, we got some funding from these two philanthropies, support from Networks Northwest. We created and incorporated the organization. We now have a new board, almost full. We're covering 10 counties, so it's basically Manistee County over to Missaukee County up to the bridge, if you can visualize the little triangle there, or the big triangle, as the case may be. And we're looking for board members that represent each of those 10 counties, along with a variety of other interests. So we have workforce development represented at the table, we have business, we have county government, local government, housing agencies, and we're close to having a full board. We have 8 members. I've got the names up for you here. I'll let you know the ones that we're filling or need to fill are Leelanau County and Kalkaska County. And we'll be making an appointment on the Leelanau County position. If you or anyone in Kalkaska County is interested in this issue, please let me know. Anyway, so that's Housing North. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our specific activities later on in the presentation, but wanted to tell you just kind of what I hope to do here today is just give you the basics of the housing issue. It's a really complex, messy thing, and often when I find when I talk with people who are not as close to the issue as I am, I find that it sounds very depressing and overwhelming because there are so many factors and so many partners at play, and there's a lot of really difficult, seemingly intractable issues going on. So I just want to give you, kind of the basics of what we're talking about and some of the solutions that are on the table for next steps, so that we're not quite so overwhelmed and exhausted by the topic, because it is really important to the community as a whole. I'm sure in all of your conversations on community issues and on your particular business interests, you come up against this topic. I'm just willing to bet. So today I'm going to, again, give you the basics. We're going to talk about what is housing exactly. We hear a lot of talk about affordable housing, workforce housing. What specifically are we talking about? short answer is everything. But we'll define some of those terms, and we'll talk about who does what. We'll talk about why this is so difficult, why developers and communities are having such a hard time creating housing. We'll talk about some of the success stories and some of the promising opportunities that are out there and ways that you can get involved. So I would like to make this more of a conversation, just so I'm not lecturing you. I'm sure you all have experience that you'd like to contribute or questions that you'd like to ask, so feel free to interrupt at any time. I'm happy to go off track to make sure that we address what you're specifically interested in. And I did hand out a couple resources for you. One is a housing needs assessment, and one is kind of a glossary of terms. And that's probably where we'll start, is just the terms themselves. I didn't put them all up on the screen because it takes 2 pages to talk about all of the terms that are out there to refer to housing. The ones that we hear most often when we talk about housing are affordable and workforce housing. But the first question in any conversation about housing is, what does that mean? The short answer is that affordable housing is housing that costs 30% or less of your income. But if you're earning $20,000, that's one number. If you're earning $80,000, that's a completely different number. And so it's not really it's not a very instructive term, I guess. It's just a very general, it gives you a general sense of what we're talking about. But really, when we talk about affordable housing, we need to also be talking about the people that we're trying to house, the people that we're providing housing opportunities for. And so then you hear people talk about low-income housing or workforce housing. And low-income housing is kind of a much more official term. It's defined by the state and the feds. They have different levels of what they consider low-income housing. One of the handouts includes a list of household incomes by percent of area median income, or AMI. That's a term you'll hear a lot in housing conversations, is what percent of AMI are we trying to reach? Area median income is, what it says, what the median income is for a county. And if you're earning below the average or the median, you're considered low income at some level. So rental housing, when you're looking at low income housing, is generally 60% of area median income. If you're looking at for sale housing, it's 80% area median income. It says low income, but I think that when you look at those numbers, that doesn't look like what our perceptions are of low income households. It's definitely not poverty level. You can be earning $60,000 a year or $80,000 a year, depending on the number of people in your household, and still be considered low income. So that term actually includes a lot of the workforce. And in this region, we know that more and more parts of our workforce are having a hard time finding a place to live. How many of you have kind of run into that in your own experience or with people that you've tried to hire in your business? So most of you, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's something that really cuts across all industries at this point. Just another term to put out there that I'll be referring to is market rate housing, and that's exactly what it says it is. It's housing that's not subsidized. It's built on the private market. It's sold on the private market. It can, be affordable to low-income households or not. It's the price is really dictated by the market. Just a few words on, kind of going back to who those households are when we talk about affordable housing and workforce housing. It's a lot of people right now. It goes from service jobs in hotels or restaurants or any hospitality industry right now, all the way on up to professionals in the healthcare industry, in manufacturing, in the public sector. It's really everywhere. And I can tell you some pretty eye-opening stories about businesses that have come forward and said, basically, we're facing this decision where either we grow or we shrink because we can't recruit people to our area because they can't find a place that they can afford, and we're paying $20 an hour. So it's not necessarily a wage thing. It's a wage imbalance. The cost of living in this region is higher than what businesses are able to are able to pay their workers. So businesses are really driving a lot of this conversation and are really looking for solutions. But it's not just the workforce that we're talking about. We know there are a lot of people who have an even harder time finding places to live, people who are living at or near the poverty level. Are any of you familiar with the term ALICE? Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. It's a new threshold essentially for income that the United Way has developed, and it really just shows the number of households in a community that are struggling to make ends meet. And it's a combination of different factors, but the big thing to know about that is when you're looking at those what are called ALICE households, about 40% of our households in this region are considered ALICE. So there's a lot of people in our region who are really struggling just to pay for basic needs. So that's a big deal for those. Housing is a big deal for those households. People with disabilities often have an even harder time because not only are they looking for housing they can afford, but housing that's accessible to them. Seniors are often in the same boat. People who are homeless, young people. Who are, just starting out in the workforce, entry-level wages, people who have gone through life changes, professionals a lot of times, well, particularly in small towns that are that we know to be less expensive on the whole, like Kalkaska or McBain or places like that, struggle to find people to work in their hospitals or their schools, not because the ownership housing is too expensive, but because there are no rentals. And when people are moving into a community from another part of the state, they're not ready to buy often, and so they end up renting. And in those communities, there really isn't a lot of rental stock available. So it's really affecting the entire community, and we know that in our region, we're going to be facing some difficult decisions in the near future if we're not able to address some of the labor shortages that we have, and we're not going to be able to deal with those unless we have housing. I don't expect you to be able to read this slide, but this is just for your reference to give you a little bit more information about what we're talking about in terms of dollars related to rent and incomes for those different percentages of AMI. Another thing I think is worth mentioning is, we're talking about housing for the whole community, but one of the things at play here is the fact that our region and our state and our country as a whole over the last several decades really focused new housing development in one particular product type. We really built a lot of single-family housing. And that was great when the baby boomers had big families and everyone was living at home. Now that we're seeing this big demographic shift and we have, a lot of baby boomers entering retirement age and they're looking to downsize. And at the same time, we have millennials who are still, who are waiting longer to start families. They have smaller households. They're very mobile. They're moving around a lot. Those two big demographics are both looking for smaller homes. And there really weren't many of them built. And we have a few other barriers related to that, in terms of zoning that doesn't allow small homes to be built in a lot of cases. So there's kind of this backlog of demand for small homes and not enough stock to meet that demand. Just kind of a window into the future here. This is from a national demographic study that was done a few years ago, but the projections are that by 2030, 83% of households in the United States won't be family households. They won't have children. So there'll be 1 or 2 people per household, 83% of our population. But at the same time, 63% of our housing stock is single-family homes, which are often too big for those 1 or 2 people households. And that's a national number, that's 63%. In Northwest Michigan, it's usually closer to 80 or 90%, unless you're living in a city. So most of our housing stock is, and when I say most, I mean almost all of our housing stock is single-family homes, but we have an older population here in Northwest Michigan and smaller households. So our housing stock and demographic mix is even more imbalanced. So we really need to be looking at what are we building. Are we actually meeting the demands of the existing and projected population? So that's a big thing to consider, and one of the reasons that we're having some trouble with our inventory right now. The projection here is that 75% of new housing stock through 2030 should be rental. And there's often questions about why do we need so much rental right now? And there's a lot of factors playing into that. One is for young people who are coming out of college, starting new jobs, they have a lot of student loan debt. And then there's also some residual fear about home ownership after the foreclosure crisis. There's also some residual economic impacts from people who went through the foreclosure process. A lot of people who lost a lot of assets during the housing market crash. And all of that kind of combined to create this growing demand for rental, while at the same time, multifamily housing construction pretty much ground to a halt for a very long time. And it's picking up. But it's harder to get those projects financed just because of all of the turmoil during that crash. So there just hasn't been the supply built to meet the demand. So, we can talk about housing needs all day long, and I think that that's where a lot of conversations about housing stop. Is okay. So we know everyone needs housing, so let's just build it. And let's stop talking about it and let's just go get this done. And there are a lot of people and groups that I know who have done that, who have started down that road. And then within a month or two, they run into one of several inevitable barriers. And then they're back to talking about why they can't move forward and what we need to do to address these barriers in the development process. So it's really, it's a difficult subject because there's a very clear problem and there's a very clear solution. We don't have enough housing, so build more. And what's wrong with you that you can't? But we know that there's a lot of challenges in between the problem and the solution. So that's why we're here today. Just to give you kind of a sense of what we're up against when we're trying to meet this demand is, if you're a developer or if you're a community group looking to start a project to build housing, you're looking for land that's affordably priced and that's located in a place that makes sense. So those two things are very difficult to find together. If you are building multifamily, you need a site that's located on infrastructure, and if it's located on infrastructure, it's going to be expensive. So finding that land is one hurdle. Infrastructure that already exists or that's affordable is another hurdle. We have some communities that have really crazy expensive hookup fees for infrastructure. And it's not through any fault of theirs. It's just the reality of them losing population, having shrinking households, not having the people there to kind of, if there are more people to share the burden, the costs go down. But as we're losing population and our people are getting older, it's been difficult for communities to provide infrastructure at a cost that's affordable. So that's tricky. Financing is difficult, and when I say financing, I mean from beginning to end, making a housing project economically viable and still affordable to the parts of the population that we're trying to reach is next to impossible, if not impossible. Depending on where you are, it's just straight up impossible. So there is a huge financial gap in a lot of cases, and finding ways to fill that gap requires some creativity and some different partners. Proper zoning is an issue in a lot of cases. And I talked a little bit about small homes and how we're really kind of seeing a shift in demand. It often starts with zoning. A lot of people would like to be able to build the product that's needed, but they have to run the gauntlet of the Planning Commission and the City Council and the angry public to make that even a conversation piece. So zoning is an issue, and then we always have an issue with public support. It doesn't matter if it's an actual development proposal or if it's just zoning changes. You can count on some people being afraid of what's being proposed because it represents something different than what they're used to. I think in general there's a lot of support for, we need new housing. If you were to talk to pretty much anyone, they would say, yeah, we need new housing. Let's build it. I'm totally supportive of it. That same person, when confronted with a project, in their general vicinity, is probably going to have a much different response to that. And it's no judgment on those. It's no judgment on those people. It's just the concept is over here and the reality is over here in most people's minds. I had talked a little bit about financing and some of the holes that we have to fill in terms of resources, the financial gaps that are out there. There are incentives at the local level and at the state level for doing workforce or affordable housing. There are grants available at the state and federal level, and we have been able to access those and use those very effectively. But it is very difficult to do. It takes a lot of time. You have to know what you're doing, and we are not very competitive in this part of the state for state and federal dollars because we're a rural region. And those programs are designed for more urban areas. So we have, we know there are pots of money out there, but they're largely unattainable to many communities here in Northwest Michigan. And then finally, we have a labor shortage. If any of you have tried doing any kind of construction project recently? Okay, so this is a reality. It's harder and harder to find construction labor. We lost a lot of contractors during the recession, and they have not come back. And we have an aging population. A lot of the tradespeople that we have here in this region are retiring, and we don't have the young people coming through the workforce that are taking those jobs. So there's a big labor shortage. We could talk about that all day, but it's really impacting the cost of development and the ability to get things done. So this is why people get overwhelmed by talking about housing. There's just a lot of problems to solve. And looking at solving those problems requires a lot of will. One of my favorite sayings is, for every complex problem, there's a solution that's clear, simple, and wrong. And that is very much the case here. If you have a big, messy problem like this, the solution is likely going to be just as big and messy. So we've kind of broken it down into three main areas of focus. And I consider these the intangible foundations of housing. First is we need to raise awareness at the public level, among the public, about what housing needs are and what solutions are, and then what their role is in the housing questions. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to talk with you today as one step on that path. We also need local leaders to be aware and involved in this issue. And having worked with so many local governments in our region, I do feel really good about the planning commissions and the elected boards that we have in many of our communities. I think there's a lot of support for the concept, but there's always turnover in those local boards. And so it's a constant education process of what the needs are and what their roles are and how they can support solutions down the road. So there's an awareness issue among local government and a need for more advocacy to work with those local leaders. There are policy fixes that we have to undertake. When I talked about some of those funding resources that are available, or rather unavailable to many of us, there are ways that we can create better access for developers and partners here in our region. With a few tweaks to existing laws or existing policies, we would be in a much better position to apply for and receive different funding sources. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but having a voice in Lansing will be important for us if we're going to solve these problems long term. And then at the local level, we do need zoning changes. And I, again, would like to emphasize, there are a lot of local leaders who are really earnestly trying to address that issue. And I'll talk some more about them specifically, but there are a lot more of them that are unaware of how their zoning impacts housing need and the development process. So that needs to change. And then finally, we have this big nebulous capacity bucket, which addresses a few things that I've touched on. One is financing and financial resources. So we know that state and federal grants are difficult to come by. They're difficult to work with. Can we create local resources? Can we create local funding that is more flexible and more responsive to what we need here in Northwest Michigan? And kind of along those same lines, how can we impact the development process itself at the local level so that we have developers who, and this is something that we hear a lot, that aren't scared off by the political climate at the local level when pursuing projects. We have, I think we have a lot of developers who want to be involved in this, but they might not have the capacity or the bandwidth to go through some of those more complex development processes or to access some of the funding resources or incentives that are out there. So how can we support them? How can we kind of build up that development capacity to get them through these processes and access those resources? And then finally, labor, which is another complex challenge in itself related to education and the workforce. So just, again, don't expect you to read all the numbers on this slide, but I want to show you the sum total of all of these barriers that I'm talking about here. This is data from the Home Builders Association of Michigan, and it shows the median new home price in different metropolitan areas in Michigan. We are at the bottom, and we have the highest median new home price in the state. It's $437,000. So to qualify for a home that price, you need to be earning over $100,000 a year. That's not an entry-level wage for many professions. But that's, again, the sum total of all of these different factors layered into each other: the cost of land, the cost of labor, some of the infrastructure issues, the unavailability of labor, all of that kind of thrown together to give us that price. So we really need to be looking at not just new construction, but how we can retrofit existing housing to add more units. We really need to be creative in addressing that. Okay, so are there any questions thus far before I get into kind of the who does what and how? Okay. Just a real quick list of some of the partners that are involved, and I say some because there might be more depending on the project. We have state and federal agencies, we have housing nonprofits, private developers, local governments, financing institutions, and the public. All of those people are involved in nearly any project that provides housing that's affordable to the workforce. So it's really a lot of cats to herd. And you can see why sometimes these projects kind of get off the rails. A little bit more information about each one of those players. When I say state and federal agencies, I'm primarily talking about HUD and MSHDA. They provide public funding for specific programs to qualified entities. That generally means housing commissions or nonprofits. MSHDA is the primary vehicle through which this money flows. It originates at HUD in most cases and then comes to MSHDA, and then MSHDA determines how they allocate that money in the state of Michigan. The big programs that they're known for are housing choice vouchers, which most people shorthand refer to as Section 8. So if you're a qualified low-income household, you can get a voucher to rent a specific type of unit. You have to meet certain MSHDA standards to use that. That's probably the most well-known program. The other big one is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, and I'll talk in more detail about that, but suffice it to say right now it's the biggest financing resource for affordable housing development in the country. And it's LIHTC for short, but it's an important one to know. HOME is another development program. It's a little bit more flexible than LIHTC. And then the Community Development Block Grant funds can be used in different ways in different parts of the state, but in Northwest Michigan, they're primarily used for home rehab. I didn't put MEDC up here, but I should have because they've been a much more present partner. MEDC is the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, and they're really focused right now on redevelopment in core communities. And they're really considering workforce housing as a key element of that redevelopment. Housing nonprofits and agencies. So probably everyone knows Habitat for Humanity. There's a few others out there: Homestretch, Northern Homes, Northwest Michigan Community Action Agency, Goodwill, the Traverse City Housing Commission, Northwest Michigan Supportive Housing. Those are the big housing nonprofits in our region. They all do slightly different things. Some of them do development, some of them don't. But generally they use subsidy or grants to build homes or provide homes that are affordable to low-income housing. So some of them might have a voucher program, some of them might actually do development, but they're pretty closely tied to funders like MSHDA and HUD. They might, outside of building, they might, like provide those vouchers that I mentioned, or they might provide support services to people who are mentally ill that need those services to stay stably housed. So there's a lot of things that housing nonprofits can do and do in our region, and they're really important partners in a lot of these projects. Private developers and builders are just that. They're the people who build the housing out there. They use private financing by and large to build market rate housing. Some of them do use the LIHTC program. More about that later. Local governments. How many of you have experience with local government in one way or another? Okay, so some people are blissfully unaware, and I say blissfully very intentionally, of how a lot of these local government processes work. If you ask someone what a clerk is or what a village president does, a lot of people can't tell you. But in this conversation, the important thing to know is what they're in charge of, whether it's a planning commission or an elected board. And by elected board, I mean city council, county board, township board. Depending on the jurisdiction, they can have a big impact on zoning. They can offer tax abatements. They can offer different types of development incentives through things like the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority or land bank authorities, and they can impact the cost of infrastructure. So this is where a lot of development conversations actually start, is at the local level. At some point, any private developer is going to have to deal with this. And the easier it is, the more housing will get built, is a short way to say that. Financing, a few different financing partners that are out there. Obviously, banks do a lot of lending for real estate development. Community development financing institutions. How many of you are familiar with CDFIs? Okay, they're basically nonprofit banks. They have I guess I would say an altruistic mission. A lot of them provide loans to populations that are considered hard to lend populations, so low-income households, minority businesses, that sort of thing. Communities that have struggled to create new investment or new business opportunities. CDFIs target those populations to try to generate more investment in a community. We have several of them that operate in our region. Opportunity Resource Fund focuses on housing development. Michigan Community Capital works closely with MEDC, and they do both commercial and workforce housing development. Venture North is more focused on small business loans, and then I left one off here, Northern Initiatives is also focused on small business loans. They provide technical assistance to their different partners. They're a really great resource. It's a lot of low interest loans, some grants, just depending on the funding source, but it does require grants and investment specifically for that purpose. And then MSHDA and HUD, I've touched on them as well. They're also really important funders, do a lot of grants to support development. Specifically, LIHTC. We're spending some time on because most conversations about affordable housing end up here at some point or another. And as I mentioned, it's the largest funding source for affordable housing. It's awarded on a competitive basis. It requires investors, oftentimes they're banks, that have a large tax liability, and they're looking for a way to write some of that off. So there are two separate programs available, 4% and 9%. The 9% is more competitive because you get more capital infused into the project with a 9% program. They're very specific about what types of projects they'll fund. So there's a lot of criteria that you have to run through with your project. It has to be, I think, is it 36 units, 24, 36 units. They want you to target specific income levels, specific populations. They might want you to have more supportive housing. They might want you to have very low income housing. They want to make sure that there are partners involved that have done this before. So there needs to be an experienced, at least consultant, involved in the project. They want to make sure that the project is located in a very specific kind of location. And by that, they generally mean in downtowns or very walkable areas. And they define walkability through this website called walkscore.com. And I mention that because it is the bane of rural Michigan's existence. We have a lot of non-traditional downtowns and very small communities that don't have all of the amenities that are required for a high walk score. So to give you an example, there was a project in Northport. You can walk from one end of Northport to the other in about 15 minutes, but it had a low walk score because there was no theater or pharmacy within walking distance. So that's the ugliest example, but that's really a barrier to accessing this in a lot of communities. And then finally, very importantly, LIHTCs also require that the local government has kind of signed off on the project, not just in name, but in providing a tax abatement through what's called a payment in lieu of taxes. So basically, how the process works is a developer puts a lot of time and money into creating this development proposal. Before they send it to MSHDA to see if they'll be awarded funding, they have to go to a public hearing at the local level and present this essentially unvetted development proposal to ask, can you please not charge me any taxes for the next 15 years? And so sometimes that's a very difficult conversation. Oftentimes that's a very difficult conversation because the local government doesn't really know if this is viable, if it's going to be funded, what they're on the hook for exactly, but they're being asked to support it at a very early level. So it can be a very fraught process. So just a few things on LIHTC. It is a great program. We have a lot of really great housing in our region because of it. It does work. When it works well. I have a couple examples here. The affordable housing at the Commons was done in part with LIHTC, and the photo on the top is in Frankfurt. That was done with LIHTC as well. There's lots of great examples. So it does work. You do have to know what you're doing. It's not for the faint of heart. You have to have the time and money to invest in it. You have to have the expertise. You have to have the support of the community, and by that I mean the public in many cases. If the neighborhood where these projects are proposed doesn't support it, then you can forget about it. The local government doesn't want to put themselves on the line for a project that the neighborhood hates. So public support is important. Local government support is necessary. Are we competitive for LIHTC in Northwest Michigan? No. The last funding round was announced in August, and there were no projects awarded funding north of Clare. And they will, MSHDA does talk about, the rural projects that they do, and I don't want to discount that. They've done a lot of great rural projects. It's not a project that's really designed around our specific needs. A lot of times these are too big for the community. They require too much infrastructure. It just oftentimes doesn't fit. So it's one of the reasons that we want to have a bigger policy discussion at the state level about the funding resources that are available. And then last but not least, we have the public as a player in all of this. And their role is pretty straightforward. They advocate for the different types of proposals that come forward, whether that's a specific development project, whether it's a pilot request, whether it's a zoning change. The public have a really strong, they have a lot of power in the process, I would say, by showing up at local government meetings. I picked this photo. It's not local, but I think it represents our demographics really well. And oftentimes when you have a project that's proposed, you're hearing from one very specific population. It's often not the people who are going to use the housing ultimately that show up at a public hearing. So that's something that I want to talk with you more about today, but there are a lot of people who are very vested in keeping their neighborhoods exactly the way they are, and they don't want to see any change. And the thought of change is very, can be frightening. So that brings out a lot of emotions. So a few things that have been successful here in Northwest Michigan. I went through the list of all the partners, you really have to have all of those people kind of bought into the project. So we refer a lot to public-private nonprofit partnerships. When all of those people are on the same page and all cylinders are firing, it works. It works not easily, but it works. We need land that's affordable. And so a lot of the successful projects that we've seen in this region over the last several years have been built on land that's been donated or acquired at below market rate. So land bank authorities have come into play here. We've had just some altruistic property owners that have stepped up, but that's a big factor. When you look at public response to these different projects, if you're looking at places like kind of blighted buildings, blighted historic buildings, commercial corridors that get a lot of traffic, any new development or redevelopment in those cases is generally seen as a good thing. So it's easier to get past that public opposition if you have the right location. And there's a lot of economic opportunity, particularly in commercial corridor areas like Garfield and 14th Street. Rehab and reuse of historic buildings. Every town has some building that's sitting empty that they would love to see reused. It's really expensive to make that work, but if you can bring in the right incentives, it does go. And it's generally really well received by the community, like the Commons, or if any of you are familiar with the orphanage in Marquette, that was one of MSHDA's bigger projects recently. They renovated this crumbling old orphanage that's now beautiful apartments. So that's a winner. And then one that we've been talking about a lot more lately is small incremental development. So little projects here and there in existing neighborhoods and commercial corridors, things that aren't overwhelming the neighborhood. Not a big, huge tower, not a 36-unit apartment building, but maybe a fourplex, maybe a 12-unit apartment building, maybe an accessory dwelling unit. That's incremental development, and that's been working really well. And then finally, I just want to mention the state and federal agencies do have a really big role in a lot of those successful projects, as do local governments through things like the Land Bank Authority and Pilot. So zoning, I want to say a few things about how that works. The type of housing that's allowed by most existing zoning is single-family, large lot homes. So we need to rethink what we're allowing to be built in most of our communities. And when we allow them, we have to think about how we're allowing them. Is it a special land use process where you have 3 public hearings and it takes 2 years to get through the process? Or is it allowed by right? That is, you meet the requirements of the zoning ordinance, you go to the zoning administrator, they check all the boxes, you have your permit. That's the way to do it. It's much faster, it's not intimidating to builders, and it ends up getting you what you want in your community. So a few of the housing types that we've been seeing a lot more demand for that may or may not be allowed or may not be easy to do, things like accessory dwelling units or granny flats, like apartments above garages, small homes, so 700, 800, 900 feet, small apartments, townhomes, duplexes, fourplexes, and then converting existing single-family homes into apartments. That's something, we've done this before. In Michigan, we've had population growth and decline, and we've had to adjust our housing stock accordingly. So we have a history of converting big old mansions into multiple apartments. It's something that we can do again. if we change zoning to allow it. So simple fixes like that will go a long way. The housing types I just listed off, the catch-all term for that is the missing middle. They're the small homes, like multifamily homes, accessory dwelling units that fit into existing neighborhoods. It's the type of housing, they call it the missing middle because it hasn't been built for a really long time. And it targets that middle chunk of our population, the lower to moderate income households, the small households that really aren't served by existing housing stock. And just a note that you don't often have to do that much to your zoning ordinance to make this stuff work. There's a lot of ways to go about it. I do want to say that you can change the zoning, but that doesn't mean you're going to solve the problem. It's not a silver bullet. It's just the first step down the road. So we have some communities that have changed their zoning, and then they sit back and wait, and then 4 years later, still nothing has happened. Sometimes it's a matter of communicating that these things are allowed. Sometimes it's just a matter of the market catching up with that particular community. But it can take a lot of time before you see those zoning changes being applied. And then the other thing that's really important to consider, and we could spend all day talking about this, but short-term rentals are a thing in Northwest Michigan. And any opportunities you create for new housing development, you have to think about the potential impact of short-term rentals like Airbnb and VRBO on those new housing opportunities. Just a couple slides real quick that we came up with last winter in terms of our short-term rental mix in Northwest Michigan. We have 3% of the state's population in this region. We have 25% of the state's short-term rentals. So we are dramatically mismatched in terms of the impact of short-term rentals on our communities. It does have an impact on the availability of housing stock. This slide here shows the growth in all housing versus the growth in what's considered seasonal housing. So you can see this is from 2010 to 2016, region-wide, there was basically no growth in year-round housing. At the same time, there was 15% growth in in seasonal housing. What that tells you is that our year-round housing is being converted into seasonal housing. So it's taking year-round housing off the market and making it unavailable to our workforce and our seniors and others who live here. So that is something that really kind of throws a wrench in the works in a lot of the housing solutions that we talk about, particularly when we talk about zoning solutions. This slide is a little out of order, but this is just to give you a sense of the missing middle housing types that I talked about. These are all in Charlevoix. There's an accessory dwelling unit over a garage. There's a couple single-family homes that were converted into multifamily homes. There's a commercial building that was converted into a duplex. So, a lot of times you hear public opposition that's, we can't change the zoning, it'll ruin the character of the neighborhood, it'll ruin our property values. So in Charlevoix, that doesn't seem to be the case. Whether these are non-conforming or legally allowed, it really fits in with the character of the community. Obviously, property values in Charlevoix are doing just fine. It's just a matter of how you make it fit into the neighborhood. Just a few more words on financing partners and opportunities. I mentioned some of these potential funders. Another one I would put out there is a place where local governments and local investors can come into play. There's a thing called a housing trust fund that takes public revenue at the local level and devotes that to locally designed housing projects or programs. Nationally, these are locally, publicly funded, but they often pool investment from other partners too. So whether that's philanthropy or whether it's businesses or other partners, a housing trust fund is one way to kind of create new resources for housing development. And it's something that there's a lot of interest in exploring here in Northwest Michigan. And I mentioned some of the state policy impacts. We talk a lot in the housing world about the criteria that we're beholden to in terms of LIHTC and some of these other programs that are out there. It's not just a housing issue. A lot of the statewide policies that are written around funding really penalize rural communities. Maybe I shouldn't say penalize, but it makes it very difficult for rural communities to access those dollars. So we really want to get this message to Lansing that one size policy doesn't fit all. We really need to think about what resources we're making available and how different types of communities can access them. So we're at Housing North spending a lot of time looking at some of the policy fixes that we could advocate for that would free up additional resources at the state level, while also creating more resources and incentives at the local level. So things like non-homestead tax vouchers. A lot of landlords don't want to rent their properties. I shouldn't say property owners don't want to be landlords and rent their properties because their taxes go up so dramatically. So is there a way to provide some kind of tax relief if they're providing year-round workforce housing? So those are the kinds of policy questions we want to ask and explore. Can we expand how pilots or payment in lieu of taxes are used? Can we give a break to employers who are providing housing, because a lot of them are? Can we change the criteria for LIHTC? Can we tweak that so that it works a little bit better for our communities? Those are a lot of big questions in terms of where we go next with state law. So Housing North, to kind of bring it back together, was created as a way to make sense of these many intangible, invisible sorts of infrastructure issues, I guess. And kind of going back to that earlier slide where we talked about, the three big solution buckets, awareness, policy, and capacity. Housing North is developing programming to impact those. So on the awareness side, we're working on providing messaging and communications tools to communities and other partners. We have a communications strategy underway. We're working with Avenue ISR to develop some messaging around housing and are looking for people to interview, people who have been involved with us either at a professional or personal level. So if you or anyone you know has had trouble finding housing, please let me know. I'd love to put you in touch with Avenue ISR. The hope is that with those communications tools, we'll be able to provide some resources to communities who are dealing with an angry public. We'll be able to provide some tools to the advocates that are working with the local governments and to developers that are trying to meet these housing needs. Because oftentimes the messages on housing projects are all over the place. We have on one hand the oppositional public, I guess I would say, that doesn't want new housing development in their neighborhood, that doesn't want zoning changed. And they have very consistent talking points, not by design, but just organically. They're worried about property values, they're worried about the impact on the community character, they're worried about those people, the people who are going to live there, they're worried about traffic. And so local governments hear this litany, this very consistent list of fears, and there's not a counterbalance to that. And so we'd like to provide some tools to very consistently address some of the misconceptions that are out there. Around policy, I mentioned a few of the things that we've been talking about. We'll be developing a policy platform and working on an advocacy strategy to push that forward in Lansing. In terms of capacity, when I talked about all of the players involved, all the cats to herd, all of those people, as I mentioned, really need to be a part of one project. So it's a lot of different resources and types of groups to pull together. So we hope to be the liaison and kind of the matchmaker to connect developers and capital with promising projects and communities. So we'll be helping both developers and communities on that front. We are already working with some employers to bring them to developers to address some of their housing needs. We're working with other communities to help them get to the root of some of their development issues so that they can attract new developers into the community. So it's really just a lot of liaising, I guess, is a word. Finally, we're exploring options for new resources. I mentioned a housing trust fund, whether that's a newly created fund, whether it's part of an existing CDFI, whether it's just leveraging existing resources that are out there. We know that there's a huge need to create and make available resources to developers and communities that are trying to build. So that's one of our big priorities. What can you do if you're interested in this issue and want to be more involved? This is kind of a tough question for such a complex problem, but there's a lot of ways that you can kind of enter into this equation. One is first to understand what we're talking about, and that's hopefully what we're doing here today. Obviously, in any issue like this, the most direct way to have an impact is to run for office or to be appointed to an existing body, whether it's a local planning commission or statewide board, or whether you run for city council or township board. Having a seat at the table is pretty powerful. You can also just act as an advocate. And when I talked earlier about the public who shows up is very often not the public that's most immediately impacted by these proposals. Being aware of what's going on and when it would be helpful for your voice to be heard is something that there's been a crying need for in this region for many years. We have, I think some strong voices that show up pretty regularly in support of housing. But it's the number of people in the room that makes a difference, sadly. So that's a huge factor. You can talk with your legislators to kind of share this one policy size doesn't fit all concept. I think in our region they know that, but we really need to be able to convey that message strongly to Lansing. And then finally, Housing North is creating a few different committees designed to attract more input and participation into particular issues. One is around advocacy, so that's the statewide advocacy piece, and the other is communications and education. We're going to be talking about our role in resource development, and if that's another committee, that's another place you could get involved too. So lots of opportunities for you to participate and learn more. I was going to share a website and I did not. I'll tell you it. But if you are looking for more data or more opportunities to get involved, the Housing North website is under construction right now. But a lot of the data is available on the Networks Northwest website. So it's networksnorthwest.org/housing. And you're always welcome to call me or email me at the contact information here. And I think I'm done and out of time. So if we have time for questions, I'm happy to take some. Yes?
Have you sat down with the real estate, the RPAC, the realtors, call to action committee?
I have not recently. We've had a lot of realtor input and involvement at different points in these conversations. I was at the women's, this last year, but I haven't been to that group. That's a great one.
And I sit with them. I'm also on the board of realtors here in the area. So I'm just wondering if there's anything for myself that I can sit down and say, this is an untapped need. Because obviously, being in our industry, we know that we need the affordable housing and the low-income housing and things that will bring more people to our community. But I think partnering with somebody like yourself would bring a little bit more opportunity for us to understand how we go about that.
I would be more than happy to come talk with them. And I think just off the top of my head, one potential role for them is just in being a voice and helping in some of that advocacy. What we found, so I've been talking about housing for 10 years, and what really made the difference in terms of getting traction was when businesses started talking about it. If businesses and realtors are saying that there's an issue and that we need to be active, then people will listen. So I think that that's a great role for realtors. And I would feel for, and not just for the realtors, but any groups, I'm happy to come and talk with them.